joining us today. My name is Perla Piekutowski. I'm the Executive Vice President for Family Source Consultants. And I'm really excited to talk today to two of my favorite people in the field. We're here with Dr. David Tourgeman from HRC. He is a board certified reproductive endocrinologist in Los Angeles, California. He has been featured in many publications such as Women Health and the New York Times, and has also been featured on Good Morning America. Dr. Tourgeman speaks Spanish, and he happened to also be my physician when I did IVF to have my own children. So it's such an honor for me to have you here today. And I also wanted to introduce Andy Vorzimer. Andy heads the Vorzimer Masterman Law Firm, third-party reproductive practice in California as well. He is a frequent author on subjects including third-party reproduction, surrogacy, and egg donation. He was the recipient of the Illumination Award from the American Fertility Association and the 2017 Whittier Law School Alumni Attorney of the Year Award. Andy is recognized as the foremost expert in the field of surrogacy, egg donation, and reproductive law. I have actually met and worked with both of them for my entire career. I have been helping intended parents for 11 years. And so I am really excited to welcome you both to have a conversation about the latest developments in this field.
Perla, thank you so much. We're honored to be a part of this, and I'm sure with Andy's knowledge, we're going to make a wonderful webinar today.
Thank you. And Andy, to get started, I know we have so many things going on with COVID today. And so would it be possible for you to share what have you seen happen with passports, entries to the country to come and do the process in the United States and also pick up the babies that these couples so long desired to have?
Absolutely. Would you like me to go ahead and share my screen so I can put up a couple of those slides?
Please do.
Absolutely. So as you know, since the beginning of the pandemic, travel restrictions have been put in place by the US government. On this first screen, you will see, as of September 28th, the most current travel restrictions. And as of today, foreign nationals who have been in any of these countries over the past 14 days are excluded from entering the United States. And as you can see, this is an extremely broad list from China, most countries in Europe, including France, Italy, Spain, Switzerland, the United Kingdom, Ireland, Brazil. They are not allowed to enter the United States if you have been in any of those countries for the past 2 weeks. Also, the land border between the United States and Mexico remains closed. And while there was some hope at the beginning of the summer that these restrictions would be lifted, based on conversations we have had with the CDC, we anticipate these travel restrictions will remain in place at least until the spring of 2021. So very disappointing. Now, with that said, we still do have the ability to get our intended parents into the country, particularly for the birth of their child. So as you'll see on this slide, there are numerous exceptions to getting into the United States. If you happen to have a spouse that is an American citizen, you're eligible to enter the United States, even if you come from any of those 35 countries. If you have a child under the age of 21 who is an American citizen, you can enter the country, and I'll go over this in a moment. And then as well, if you have a parent or a sibling that is a US citizen, you are exempt from the travel restriction and can enter America. Now, for all of our intended parents, and Dr. Tourgeman's patients as well, they can enter the United States for the birth of their baby because their child, by virtue of being delivered here by a US citizen, a surrogate, is automatically given birthright citizenship. So the babies are US citizens. Now, the real issue that we're having, Perla, is that depending on which of the 12 international airports that are open to these travelers, Custom and Border Patrol are taking different positions depending on the airport, believe it or not. So with most of the CBP officers, if you have a surrogate who is about to deliver your child, they will allow you into the country because you will have a child that is an American citizen that needs its parents to make medical decisions and to take custody of the baby. However, we have had some incidents in which certain CBP officers, either at the airport of departure when they get the passenger manifest or upon arrival in the United States, will demand on presentation of a birth certificate to show that the child has been born. Now, most of our intended parents are trying to get into the United States at least 2 weeks prior to the anticipated delivery date, in part so that they can self-quarantine and be allowed into the hospital. But if your baby has not been born at certain airports, they may not allow those intended parents in because the child has yet to be delivered and thus is not a US citizen. In those situations, on a case-by-case basis, we will make an appointment for the intended parents at the closest US consulate to get a consular officer to write a letter that can be presented to the CBP officer, allowing them entry into the United States because of the anticipated delivery of their baby, allowing them then to self-quarantine for 2 weeks, be able to be in the hospital, at least one of the parents, stay in the delivery room. We'll also, to the extent possible, get a private room for those intended parents so that they can stay during the entire duration of the baby stay in the hospital with their baby. And the last point I would make before I turn the screen back is that most of the hospitals now who would typically hold those babies for 48 hours, we're seeing discharge times now of 24 to 36 hours to reduce possible exposure to the baby. So bottom line is we can get the intended parents into the United States for the birth of their baby. Depending on what airport they're going to arrive at, we may request and schedule an appointment with them at a consulate close to them to get a letter from the US consulate to be presented to Border Patrol. We will also be sending all international intended parents a packet of information, including the judgment, a doctor letter from Dr. Tourgeman, if he was the treating physician, as well as an attorney declaration explaining the necessity of those intended parents to be allowed to enter the United States.
Have you seen that there is cooperation from other governments, overseas, for intended parents to get a visa to get here? Because I remember at the very beginning, they were a little bit difficult in, to get an appointment, for example, for the intended parents.
It was difficult. Some of the consulates were closed for a while so that they could not get in for the appointments, but the consulates are now across the United States as well as throughout the world reopened as of the beginning of October. So the ability to get in and get an appointment is not going to be that difficult. I have some slides I can show in a moment to indicate how we can get the passport to get the baby out of the country. The biggest issue, Perla, there are a few countries, China in particular, that will allow the intended parents to leave the country, but surprisingly are not giving them permission to return because they're coming from one of the world's, ironically, hotspots. It's kind of crazy to think that of all countries, China in particular right now, we have one intended parent in China that we were able to get permission to enter the United States for the birth of his child. That was 15 weeks ago. But the Chinese government will not give him permission to return back to China with his child because they're concerned about bringing coronavirus back in. He happens to live in Wuhan, coincidentally. But for most of the countries, returning home is not going to be a problem. They may ask that they quarantine. In fact, with many of the countries now, they're putting international visitors into government-run hotels right now. They're asked to put bracelets on to monitor their movement. And after 14 days, they can leave the hotel and return home.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that, Andy. That's really, really helpful. I know when I talk to intended parents, they're always asking about, what has changed, how easy it's going to be to go back home. And I think that's one of the biggest concerns right now. And other concern that Dr. Tourgeman can address here is when it comes to COVID, do we have any information about whether this would affect the surrogate when she's pregnant, would affect the baby, would affect the outcome? And in your practice, what has changed in regards of the protocol and what you are requiring to proceed with a cycle.
Thanks, Perla. I'm going to also screen share here, so allow me. So as you probably know, this is evolving, and medical issues do take some time to become evident. At this time, what we're seeing is that pregnant women indeed are much more likely to be hospitalized when they do get COVID, and typically have a higher risk for ICU admission or intensive care unit admission, and tend to be also at higher risk for needing to be ventilated. Early in the days of the disease, what we saw was, at least per the Chinese studies, were that there were no increased risk during pregnancy. However, as you can imagine, those pregnancies were very late in the third trimester, and there was no reports of adverse pregnancy outcome. However, with increasing data, what we have indeed found is that there may be an adverse pregnancy outcome, not only for the mother, as mentioned, but also for the child. In the case of preterm delivery, there's certainly unique neonatal risk from the preterm birth. Those include obviously all those that you would envision in a normal scenario, with cerebral, gastrointestinal, cardiac, numerous risk to the neonate. However, at this point, what we know is that these risks are related to preterm birth, and there's not a unique neonatal risk per se. This is probably going to change as we learn more in the medical community what type of injury, if any, there is on the neonate. What we do currently, because again, this is an evolving issue, is that we check all patients and including the surrogates for current antibodies. So when we do antibody tests for COVID, what we test for is prior exposure of any sort. So they could be currently infected, or they could have had prior exposure. So that's the antibody test. If indeed the antibodies are positive, what we will do is follow up with something called a PCR test, where we actually test to see if there is an active infection. And if that is the case, then what we will do is usually, in the case of surrogacy, postpone an embryo transfer. The truth of the matter is, again, the medical part is still evolving, and we don't really even know what a prior exposure means. So let's say the surrogate has cleared the virus, she's not actively infected. What we can tell for certain is that we don't know. Is there going to be some type of ill impact on the child? We really do not know at this point. So unfortunately, we are learning as we go along, and the situation at the time is that we are testing and then counseling based on what we find. Obviously, if there's no current exposure, then then we allowed the patient or the surrogate in that case to go ahead and try to conceive.
Thank you for that. Hopefully we'll learn more as we go, as you said. Switching gears a little bit, I would like to learn what options we have when it comes to insurance. That's another question that I get asked often by intended parents when it comes to the surrogates coverage and the newborn coverage upon birth.
All right.
So that's all you, Andy.
All right, I'm just gonna share my screen and give me 1 second. Here we go. So as you'll see, Perla, we have a number of slides that I've shared. I won't go through and read all of the slides. I think the material is pretty detailed, and then I can follow up on any questions anyone has. But obviously we have two separate issues on the insurance side. One is coverage for the surrogates, and the second will be coverage for the newborn baby. Now, let me just start with the newborn baby coverage, since that tends to be the most significant issue, particularly for our international intended parents. For domestic intended parents, clearly there really is not much to be concerned about. If the intended parents have existing health insurance, they'll have 60 days after their baby is born to notify their carrier and get retroactive coverage from the day their baby was born. We also have the ability to buy an individual plan just for the child. So if the intended parents have a baby that's born out of state and thus out of network and may have an extended stay in a NICU, or they have a friendly pediatrician in their neighborhood that's not part of their plan's network, they can also buy an individual plan for their child, again, up to 60 days after birth, and we'll help them obtain those policies and get retroactive coverage. The real issue, obviously, is for international intended parents as a result of changes to the Affordable Care Act over the last 4 years. Insurance companies are now insisting that international intended parents prove residency before they can secure a newborn policy for their baby. This is a dramatic change from a few years ago when we were able to register these children as American citizens and be able to purchase an Affordable Care Act policy for those babies. In order to demonstrate residency now under these new regulations, these international intended parents will have to prove, number one, that they have a driver's license, a voter's registration, or a utility bill, and they have to provide two forms of proof. So obviously for international intended parents, they're not going to have a voter's registration. Driver's licenses are tied to their passport status. So there's really no opportunity, with a few exceptions, to purchase inexpensive newborn insurance here in the United States. So we're obviously left to look at other options. I have some of the options on this screen. Let me see. Here we go. The primary option we're recommending for most of our international intended parents now is the Allianz plan. It's the most cost-effective plan. It will run anywhere between around 5,000 to 6,000 euros for that policy. It will provide international travelers insurance for one of the intended parents, and 32 weeks after the baby is born, coverage for any newborn. Two important things to know about the Allianz plan. Number one, it does not cover twins, so it will only work for a singleton pregnancy. And secondly, because of how many international intended parents have begun using this policy, they've had to add a delay as to when the newborn coverage will kick in. It used to be 24 weeks after the purchase of the policy, the plan would kick in. So we used to advise our intended parents to purchase the Allianz plan about 2 weeks before the embryo transfer, recognizing that a baby is medically viable about 22 and a half weeks into the pregnancy. That changed, so now the policy has to be in place for 32 weeks. So we're advising all of our international intended parents to purchase the Allianz plan, and I recommend the policy that costs about 5,800 euros. It'll offer 2,250,000 euros in coverage for the child, but they need to buy that about 10 weeks before the embryo transfer to protect against that worst case scenario of a newborn being born prematurely at around 22, 23 weeks. Some of the other policies out there, Great Morning, they do cover twins. There's a couple of other twin policies out there. They're very, very expensive, though, as you know. It's now much more cost efficient, believe it or not, to work with 2 surrogates simultaneously than buying twin coverage. We still have the Lloyd's plans, and then obviously any kind of cash discount we can negotiate with the hospital. Now, really quickly, oh, go ahead, Perla.
I am sorry to interrupt you there, but I do have a lot of intended parents that often come to us wanting to have twins, and they're international. So I think you are covering a very good point in there. And I think they would be interested to hear how much would the policies typically cost and how much would it cost them? You know, you and I have seen those very high bills for our intended parents in the past. So I wanted to see if you could please share your experience as to what kind of risks they are taking financially. And then I would love to hear Dr. Tourgeman's point of view on the medical side when it comes to twins as well.
Sure. So if we use the Allianz as sort of the template policy that most international intended parents are looking at, as I mentioned, we're recommending the 5,800 euro plan. And that includes a premium, deductible, everything is included within that. And you're going to get up to $2,250,000 in coverage. And as you know, Perla, even if a baby is going to spend 3 to 4 months in the NICU, and they're born between 22, 23 weeks, we have seen daily NICU bills between $50,000 to $80,000 a day, but still that $2,250,000 limit should be enough, particularly after we come in to negotiate those fees down. And normally we can get anywhere between a 40 to 60% discount. They're really looking at about $5,000 to $6,000 US out of pocket to cover their baby for any extended stay in a NICU. Now, for most of our international intended parents, the baby's going to spend less than 48 hours in the hospital. We'll negotiate a cash discount. The average payment at discharge for a healthy newborn is between $1,500 and $2,000 US. They simply put it on a credit card. They don't even need to submit a claim to Allianz, or they can. But for most of our couples, the Allianz plan really is just for that added coverage in the event of a premature delivery. Now, if we're looking at a twin delivery, and you start looking at the kind of policies that have been available, they're in the 6 figures. You're going to pay somewhere between $100,000 to $130,000 between the premium and deductible for twin coverage. And that's why I indicated earlier, many of our international intended parents are going to an elective single embryo transfer, shooting for a singleton. Some of them will work in parallel with 2 surrogates simultaneously, which does present some logistical issues and other concerns, or they'll stagger their transfers. They will sign up with 2 surrogates and have the transfers anywhere from 3 to 6 months apart. This way, they have that one Allianz plan that's going to cover each of their newborns and not have to look at a 6-figure twin policy, which is the only ones that are available now. And roughly, again, about $135,000 for twin coverage when you add everything into it.
Yeah, that's very scary. And, you know, we want the intended parents to be informed. And it's not only the financial aspects, but also the medical aspects. So, Dr. Tourgeman, what can you share with the intended parents that are hoping to do embryo transfers of 2 embryos in hopes to have twins?
Yeah, I think that there's been an evolution of assisted reproductive technologies from a medical perspective that have really sort of refined our ability to guide the patient. So as you probably know, there was multiple newsworthy stories of, you know, octuplets being born, and really that was sort of the brow raiser for the medical community that practices reproductive endocrinology. And it also led to finer detail from the American Society of Reproductive Medicine. And those guidelines, although they had been in place, were more likely to be acknowledged as important factors when the physician was making a choice as to how many embryos to replace, whether it was in the patient's own uterus or into a surrogate. A lot of that was really guided by maternal age, or at least the age of where the egg was, the origin of the egg. So in the scenario of an egg donor, for example, really the push was to transfer, and has been to transfer, just a single embryo. There has been another change, and that is routine utilization of pre-implantation genetic testing for aneuploidy. And what that means is we're testing the embryos for normalcy across all 23 pairs of chromosomes. And it's a very accurate test. Really, we expect in excess of 97% accuracy when checking for all 23 pairs of chromosomes. So if indeed we have a normal embryo, we're talking about a very competent embryo for implantation. When we test these embryos from egg donor, or from a woman that's less than 35 years of age, we expect the implantation rate to be north of 60%. And it really does curtail the desire to encourage more than a single embryo. There are certainly things that are going to change that, and that is, let's say we are dealing with a patient that is 42 years of age, and even though that embryo may have been tested for chromosomal normalcy, we expect the implantation rate in, let's say, a 42-year-old to be much less than a younger, an egg from a younger origin. And it could be certainly less than half of what we would expect in an egg donor. So let's say the origin of the egg is 42, we'll expect an implantation rate, let's say, of 25% for that embryo. If you add multiple failed embryo transfers to the mix, there may be the encouragement from the physician to transfer more than just one. But in the scenario of gestational surrogacy, I think most of us reproductive endocrinologists have really swayed away from multiple embryos. Not only does it increase morbidity in the pregnancy, but as Andy mentioned, the financial impact can be very severe. You're muted.
You're muted, Perla.
Sorry about that. Thank you so much for sharing, and so important for the intended parents to know what the risks are when they make the decision of transferring two embryos. And you know, many of them are using an egg donor, and you mentioned that as well. So it sounds like they have a higher chance of success, and the recommendation is that they do a single embryo transfer. I wanted to switch back to insurance for a little bit, because we are getting close to open enrollment. And actually, we got a question from one of the attendees, and they wanted to know if there are any specific states that would allow open enrollment for gestational surrogates after December.
Yes, I think I have a slide for that. Give me 1 second. All right, here we go. It should pop on in a second. There we go. So as you'll see, open enrollment will begin on Sunday everywhere in the United States. For most states, it'll end December 15th. I believe I have another slide in a moment that will show you the individual state deadlines. But for most states, November 1st to December 15th. Minnesota will go as late as December 22nd. Now, keep in mind, as a general rule, if you buy the policy between the 1st and the 15th of the month, it will become effective the 1st of the following month. If you purchase the policy between the 15th and the end of the month, it won't be until the month after that. So if you purchase the policy January 17th, it will commence March 1st. As you'll see, the average premium nationwide will be about $664 a month, up about 6% from 2020. And we're seeing, unfortunately, increased maximum out of pocket. On average now, we're looking around $8,000 per year. Now, here's the individual states that have open enrollment that extends beyond December 15th. So as you can see, these states will go as late as January 31st, including New York, New Jersey, Minnesota, then Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Washington will go later in January as well. I should also point out that some states do have or did have a special COVID enrollment window. We don't know if that will be reopened again in 2021. The key thing to understand about any kind of COVID open enrollment that may go past December 15th or any of the dates you'll see on this slide is that the surrogate must have no insurance at all. The fact that if she has any coverage at all, she will not be eligible for the special COVID enrollment. If she has no coverage at all, though, she may be eligible for a special COVID open enrollment window.
So if a surrogate is scheduled to have an embryo transfer in February, but the effective coverage starts in March, or maybe she has an embryo transfer scheduled for January, what should the intended parents do between the embryo transfer and the effective coverage date?
Well, it's entirely up to them. They obviously can move forward with an embryo transfer, recognizing that Dr. Tourgeman, whoever the treating physician is, will likely be treating that surrogate for the first 6 to 10 weeks after the embryo transfer takes place. So you wouldn't expect any claims to be generated under the surrogate's insurance. So as a general rule, if we know that the surrogate's going to apply for a new policy, let's say November 1st, we're okay with an embryo transfer taking place the end of November or December, since we won't expect claims to begin to be generated by the OB/GYN until January or February. But the key thing is they have to understand there is some risk. Biggest risk would be a miscarriage, and there may be a D&C. And if that coverage is not kicked in, the intended parents would be responsible for whatever cash pay discount we could obtain with the doctor that had to perform that procedure.
Thank you, Andy. I have one more question about insurance before we change topics. And that is, what options do intended parents have available as, when open enrollment starts? I know we have ACA, but can you talk a little bit about the options since we're so close to, to having open enrollment?
Right. So one of the things that we're seeing, and I believe I have some slides on this. Give me 1 second. Obviously, the ACA plans are the ones that we do recommend because no caps, no limits. We obviously have policies, whether it's the Lloyd's plan, if we have to purchase it outside open enrollment, but when we start adding up the premiums, deductible, the administration fee, we're seeing costs of around $33,000. So I'm still recommending the ACA plans, but the big thing to keep in mind, Perla, as you know, there's been a trend in the insurance industry now to begin asserting liens against the surrogate's compensation. We've had companies like TRICARE and Kaiser assert these liens, for years and years, but companies like Blue Cross and Blue Shield, which had become sort of our go-to plans if we had to purchase an individual policy for these gestational carriers, they're realizing that they're losing money on these plans. Between the premium deductible, perhaps it was $10,000 a year, but in an average pregnancy, these insurance companies were paying out $30,000 to $60,000 in benefits, and they were losing money. So starting January 1st of 2020, Blue Cross, Blue Shield joined companies like Kaiser and HealthNet and began asserting liens. Now those liens, they've attempted to assert the liens to as much as 50% of the surrogate's compensation. So if you're compensating a surrogate $45,000, potentially you're looking at a lien as much as $22,500. Some states that lien is capped at no more than 33%. So it would be $15,000. Now we will negotiate those liens down depending on the provider, but intended parents now have to realize that if their surrogate does not have an employer-funded health plan available to them, and they have to purchase an individual ACA policy, they are likely to have to cover a lien. That money will have to be deposited in trust, remain for 12 months after the birth of the child, because that's how long it can take the insurance company through their third-party administrators to audit the account. Many of these insurance companies are requiring that their insured submit a copy of the contract before any embryo transfer takes place. So it wasn't like the old days where they wouldn't ask for a copy of the contract, they wouldn't know. Now you can forfeit your coverage if you don't submit a copy of the contract with the compensation. So as surrogate compensations continue to increase, so too do the cost of these liens. And we are encouraging, our clients and the agencies to the extent possible to try to fight against, the inflation we're seeing on these liens, find other creative ways to reimburse the surrogate, whether it's healthy food allowances or gym allowances, things that perhaps can reduce that top line so that the intended parents aren't, spending an exorbitant amount on these liens that, can be anywhere from $15,000 to $25,000 above and beyond the cost of that policy.
We have a question from the audience on the topic of insurance. Does the surrogate have to have a major medical policy in place before a bridge plan can be obtained?
They do need to have a policy in place that bridge the gap. Those policies, whether it's a policy or it's just simply the broker negotiating cash discounts with the individual medical providers, there still has to be an underlying policy in place. If that policy denies a claim, then it triggers that bridge the gap policy, and then they'll have to pay that full amount, which if it's a Lloyd's plan, again, you're looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of at least $33,000. So I think one of the most important things any intended parent can do is to make sure a proper insurance review is done on the surrogate's policy before moving forward. I'm not a huge fan of these bridge the gap policies. In many cases, it's an unnecessary expense that they're paying. If we have a carrier that historically has paid these benefits or has inclusionary language in their policies that say we will cover a member's pregnancy if serving as a surrogate, then we don't recommend the bridge the gap plan. But they will need to have at least applied for a private ACA policy in order to gain the benefit of the bridge the gap plan.
Thank you, Andy. I think we lost Dr. Tourgeman.
Yeah, with all the winds here, he may have had his internet knocked out. Hopefully he'll come back quickly. We're having some 50, 60 mile an hour winds with red flag warnings here in Los Angeles. It's a crazy morning.
That's where I was going with the next question. So let's continue talking about the legal aspects of the process in the meantime to give him a chance to come back to us. Andy, so when it comes, let's switch back a little bit to when you started talking about the entry to the United States. So how long do you think the intended parents are gonna have to stay in the United States after their baby is born before they can go back home? What are you seeing lately?
Great question. I think I have a slide for that. Let me bring that up. Here we go. So the good news is, Perla, as of October 14th, the Department of Consular Affairs is now allowing in-person applications for passports. So that's been a welcome change. So what I'm recommending that our clients do is that, once they have the anticipated delivery date and we're early in that third trimester, they begin considering booking their tickets to come to the United States. I'm encouraging them to get unrestricted round trip flights so that approximately 3 weeks after the anticipated delivery date would be the date I would choose for their return home. And now what they can do is they can book an appointment. As long as that appointment was within 3 days of their departure date, you can make that appointment up to 2 weeks before your departure date, make an appointment with the consulate or embassy, and be able to obtain your baby's passport. Now they can do it themselves in person. And hold on, here's the other slide. Here's the expedited application process. You can see you can call up to 2 weeks in advance to make the appointment. The appointment has to be within 3 days of your scheduled return home. And if we need a visa, it can be up to 10 days. You'll have to prove proof of your travel plans. There's a $60 expediting fee to rush the passport. And both intended parents and the newborn must appear at the passport agency for that appointment, but you can get the passport now within 72 hours or within 3 days of your flight home. We recommend that you make a morning appointment. If you do, you can get the passport by the end of the day. If not, and for some of our intended parents, as you know, Perla, they may spend 2 or 3 months here in the United States. So they allow their baby's immune system to develop a little bit longer, plus to address any visa issues they need in order to return home to their countries. In that case, we would recommend you work with a company like Passport and Visa Advisors. They will handle everything, all the paperwork, walk it through the US Passport Office, and bring the baby's passport directly to the intended parents. Now, normally we would recommend a passport service like this for all of our international intended parents. Unfortunately, the passport offices are not allowing third-party walk-in services yet, like Passport Visa Advisors, but they do expect sometime in November that we can use an agency to go ahead and obtain the passport. But right now, the intended parents need to be prepared to go in person with their baby to request an expedited passport that shouldn't take more than 72 hours to get.
Thank you, Andy. Obviously, there is so much education and so much to learn about this field, and that's why we recommend the intended parents, engage an attorney early on so that they can have these discussions about insurance, about the contracts, about returning back home with their baby, their passports, everything that there is to know about surrogacy. Now, we get intended parents who don't want to engage an attorney early on because they want to wait until they have a surrogate and they would like to hire an attorney that is local to that surrogate. On the flip side, we also have intended parents that already have an attorney. The attorney may be in Florida, but they want to be matched in Illinois. Should the intended parents always retain an attorney in the state where the birth will happen, or can the intended parents use an attorney in their own state?
It's a great question, Perla. The intended parents can use a reproductive law attorney anywhere in the United States as long as that attorney has a sufficient level of competence and expertise in the laws of whatever state their surrogate lives and delivers in. And as you know, coming into an agency, most intended parents have no idea what state their surrogate may come from or if she'll even remain in that state. So we're able to work in 47 states throughout the country. What we do ask, part of our internal protocols, is that the surrogate be represented by an attorney in her state. And by ensuring that we have a local attorney representing the surrogate, we know we have the most current information available to all parties about the current climate and status of the law in those states. But perhaps more importantly, we're able to work cooperatively with the surrogate's attorney to file for the pre-birth order or post-birth application process. So if we're representing intended parents that live in Illinois but have a surrogate delivering in Florida, we would be able to represent that Illinois couple, and we would recommend attorneys in Florida to represent the surrogate, and we'll work with that attorney in Florida to get the parental order and then assist them in their return home. So it's more important that the surrogate be represented by local counsel than the intended parents. I do recommend that intended parents begin working with an attorney from the moment they engage the agency to assist the intended parents in identifying the most appropriate states to work in, to be able to go over the advantages and disadvantages of a given state, insurance information, how that would come into play. As you know, Perla, there's variability from state to state, county to county, judge to judge, and we need to know, as an example, in many instances, particularly with international intended parents, if they live in a particular county in Pennsylvania or Ohio, the results could be different, and how that could impact the timing, their ability to return home, the ability to get a pre-birth order. So with our firm, we will not ask our clients to formally engage us until they have matched with the surrogate, but we make our services available for free as a resource to help guide them until they finally match, and then they can engage our service. But we'll help them, whether it's with the IVF facilities consent forms, reviewing profiles, insurance, explaining how we would be able to finalize their parental rights, giving them estimated cost sheets, as well as a timetable to go home. And the final thing that we'll do, again, particularly with international intended parents, is to coordinate with local counsel in their home country to address everything from citizenship to post-birth parental orders, so that the documents we prepare at the time we draft the contract will be compliant with the local laws in their country, so there are no difficulties in them getting a post-birth parental order in their home country, establishing citizenship, and even securing a new birth certificate from their country of origin.
Thank you, Andy, and welcome back, Dr. Tourgeman. We lost you there for a second.
Sorry about that.
No worries, Andy. You explained about the winds in California.
Yes, absolutely. Very, very windy.
So, Dr. Tourgeman, we have talked about everything that there is after a pregnancy, but we have not talked about how do we get to that baby? How do we get to that pregnancy? So could you please talk to the intended parents about what the process is about? Some of them are going to be using their own eggs and some others are going to use an egg donor. Could you please explain a little bit how the IVF process works in both cases?
Absolutely. Very, very similar, whether we're using an egg donor or the intended mother is stimulating her own ovaries. Basically, there is some type of evaluation, and that evaluation allows us to basically understand the ovarian reserve. And that could be an ultrasound, it could be some blood test for a blood called anti-Müllerian hormone. We can test blood work on a specific day of the menstrual cycle, typically the second, third, or fourth day of the menstrual cycle, for two other blood tests called follicle stimulating hormone and estradiol. Once we've surmised the ovarian reserve of the patient, we'll then gauge how much medication to give that particular patient. The medication that we give is actually something that's already produced by the body. It's called follicle stimulating hormone, and the body understands it very, very well. The caveat is that it's a protein, and so it's a lot like insulin in that regard. It can't be taken orally because it's a protein, and if it's taken orally, it'll get degraded. So we have to administer the medications by injection just below the skin. We call that a subcutaneous injection. And that medication goes on for approximately somewhere between 9 and 12 days. And during that time, we're simply evaluating how the follicles, or how the eggs within the follicles are growing. And once they're ready, then what we do is we schedule the extraction of the eggs from the follicles within the ovaries. And fortunately, it's not a very daunting procedure, but it is a procedure. Typically, we use an IV medication so that the patient basically is taking a nap, if you would, and feels no pain. And during that procedure, what we do is we use an ultrasound with the small needle attached to it to basically puncture each one of the follicles within the ovary. Fortunately, this is a procedure that's without incision, meaning we go through the vagina and capture the eggs that way. Again, the procedure only lasts about 15 minutes in most cases. And once the eggs are obtained, they're passed on to the awaiting embryologic team that identifies the eggs and ultimately is able to join them with the sperm of choice and then grow those embryos out in the laboratory.
Are you, have you seen a change, between when you started doing this process to now when it comes to the use of the statistics for fresh cycles versus frozen cycles?
So yes, I mean, we've seen great changes in the 20 years that I've been practicing. A lot of it has to do with how the ovaries are stimulated. We call those protocols for stimulation. In the old days, we would have to use a medication called Lupron, basically to cause the brain to not produce hormones that would potentially interfere or cause premature ovulation of the eggs. By far and large, most of the times that we use protocols today to stimulate the ovaries, we're using something called an antagonist protocol. And with those protocols, there is not the long delay of injections that used to be required in the Lupron or long protocols. So we've been able to diminish the amount of time to prepare the ovaries for the extraction of the eggs. One of the other things that has changed remarkably is the use of pre-implantation genetic testing for chromosomes. And I will tell you that by far and large, today what is used is something called next generation sequencing to evaluate the number of chromosomes. And these tests generally require some time to run the analysis. So what is commonly done today is that the egg retrieval is achieved or affected, fertilization then occurs, and then what is done in those scenarios is the embryos are grown for 5 to 6 days, at which time a sample is obtained from each embryo. Those embryos are then frozen, and we wait for the analysis of the PGS testing. And then what we do is prepare the uterus for a frozen embryo transfer. In the old days, there was the desire to almost not freeze the embryos, to just get them in as soon as we could, because the freezing process was not as well perfected as it is today. And so there would be some attrition of embryos simply from the freezing procedure that, that today we don't endure. So in the old days, we would tend to fresh transfer. Today, we are now often doing the pre-implantation genetic testing. And as a result of that, waiting for those results requires freezing of the embryos.
You mentioned that we are now transferring frozen embryos to give a chance to the intended parents to do PGT. What about those intended parents that are using an egg donor? What are their chances of success with a fresh cycle versus frozen eggs?
It's a very good question. I'm going to bring up a slide that I prepared. Allow me to screen share. Okay, I think that's up. So by far and large, the most common way to obtain eggs in the past was to use a fresh egg donation cycle. And so that would require the parents to identify an egg donor, that met their needs, whether that was looks on a wish list or education, social background, so on and so forth. But once the egg donor was identified, there would be a contract that was put into place, and then the egg donor would need to be screened. And let me actually, just before I show this, I'm gonna go to this slide. So the screening process includes the physician evaluating her, and in that evaluation, typically what is the information that what we want is to understand if there's been prior donations and what those outcomes were, and if there had not been prior donations, then understanding what the likelihood of a good cycle would be. And so that would be the same type of screening process for ovarian reserve that we spoke of earlier. In addition to that, we'll do an infectious disease screening. We'll do a urine drug screen, as well as commonly today, a genetic screening that involves blood work and test for the potential for autosomal recessive diseases. And then finally, obviously, there will be a psychologic evaluation. So it is a very lengthy process. In addition to that, once we've said, okay, we're okay with utilizing this egg donor, the case is then passed back to the intended parents to work on with their attorneys, such as Andy, to evaluate if there's any issues that become important when making the contract between the egg donor and the intended parent. Once we've been given the all okay, what we will do is bring the egg donor in, make sure that everything is fine with regard to her ovaries to start the stimulation process. And then what we will do is obtain FDA screening on the egg donor. What that entails is a questionnaire that's actually quite lengthy about any kind of risk. We'll do a physical examination, and we will send blood to an FDA registered lab. That will be for infectious diseases. And once that is all done, we will be able to stimulate her ovaries, which again is a mirror image of stimulating someone else's, one's own ovaries. Again, the process takes about 2 weeks. With regard to sort of comparing it to frozen eggs, I think that if it hasn't become clear, that the egg donation cycle really does take time when using a fresh egg donor, meaning taking the eggs directly out for a specific couple from a specific egg donor. And 3 to 6 months is not uncommon. It is very costly. Depending on the cost of the egg donor compensation, and including the medical aspect of this, we often see the total cost of the egg donor cycle reaching $40,000 to $50,000. So very, very expensive. The interesting thing is, and whether you see this as an advantage or disadvantage, is the number of eggs is totally variable. The one thing that the intended parents can do to sort of put things in their favor is really, in an idealized way, find an egg donor that has donated before. This way, there's a better sense of the number of eggs that they will be able to get. This may seem obvious, but the more eggs a couple gets, largely the likelihood of success increases. The caveat is with the fresh egg donation cycle, sometimes the cycle does not go well and they can get very few eggs. And it's a huge financial outlay for couples that sometimes end up with sometimes no embryos for transfer. I want to take this time to sort of compare that to frozen eggs because really, I think it is the wave of the future. The biggest advantage is that the eggs are already there. They've already been pre-screened, not only for the FDA testing that we talked about, but for genetic predispositions. The cost tends to be a lot lower, often less than half of what we would expect in a fresh egg donation process. I would say that the potential biggest disadvantages are that there's only so many donors that have frozen their eggs before for that intended parent to choose from. Also, this could be seen as a disadvantage is that you'll only get X number of eggs. So let's say you decide to purchase 5 or 6 eggs, that's all you'll get. And with a limited number of eggs, there's a lesser chance of success. Again, maybe necessitating more eggs to be purchased. I've obviously just noted an error here, but it should say the biggest advantage is there's no wait time. There's no need to, spend the 3 to 6 months of screening, essentially ready to go. And I think that if this hasn't already become obvious to many, just as the FDA requires quarantine for donated sperm, I think that with the advent of vitrification and our excellent egg survival from freezing the eggs today, that it will probably be what is required from the FDA, or at least it wouldn't surprise me if that's what's ultimately required from the FDA in the near future.
Thank you, Dr. Tourgeman. Now, you've talked about genetic testing on the eggs. Would you recommend genetic testing on the embryos created with an egg donor?
Bear with me, I'm trying to, there we go.
And we lost Andy now.
Okay.
California wins.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. As I was moving the screen around, you asked,
would you recommend genetic testing on the embryos created with an egg donor?
The implantation rate per embryo with an egg donor source is, as I mentioned earlier, very good. We do expect in excess of 60% implantation. And a lot of those embryos are going to be chromosomally normal. There's multiple factors to consider. And for example, one of the things that would really, I think, make or hurt a family very much is to proceed with an egg donor cycle to only have run across a miscarriage. I think that would make the appeal for not testing embryos less advantageous and less desired for that matter. So there is a technology of testing the embryos, which is extremely medically sound and really does give improvement to the family to have a healthy child. I'd say the one downside to testing embryos from an egg donor source is the added cost, generally in the neighborhood of around $5,000. But if it were not for the financial impact I think that testing an embryo from even egg donor source is a reasonable thing to consider, given what that family has probably been through to ultimately have to consider an egg donor to conceive.
Thank you, Dr. Tourgeman. Andy, on that topic, when it comes to the costs, do we use a contract for frozen eggs? And what are the cost differences with a fresh donor? You're muted.
There we go. There we go. Sorry, our internet connection dropped as well. Apologize. So typically, if you're purchasing frozen eggs, you're going to buy it directly either from an IVF facility or a donor agency, donor bank. And they will provide the contract when essentially they sell the eggs to the recipient parents. Now, it does make sense for the recipient parents to have their attorney review the agreement, but it's largely a template contract that was executed initially between the clinic or the egg bank and the donor. And then when those eggs are sold, there's a separate contract prepared by that bank or clinic with the recipient parents. With a fresh cycle, there is a contract that must be drafted by the recipient parent's attorney between the recipient parents and the egg donor. The egg donor will be represented by her own independent lawyer. There may be some negotiations, particularly when it comes to subsequent use of excess embryos, potential contact between the recipient parents and their donor, and potential contact later in life between the child and the donor, if that's something that all parties are open to. So typically, to summarize, with frozen eggs, there won't be a contract drafted by the recipient parent's attorney. It would be more of a form agreement by the clinic or bank. If you're doing a fresh cycle, then there will need to be a contract drafted. Thankfully, it's not a complicated process. The legal work is effectively completed when the contract is signed. From beginning to end, the legal process, at least on the contract side, is 3 to 5 days at most.
For the egg donation process, does the attorney can the attorney be in any state as well, or do they have to be in the state where the intended parents or the surrogate reside, the egg donor reside?
As a general rule, it does not matter what state the attorney is in, as long as that attorney is competent and familiar with the underlying laws in that state. So there are certain states, like Louisiana as an example, that has very, very unique laws with respect to donors and embryos, essentially giving fetal personhood status to those embryos. So in those unusual situations, you may want to have a local lawyer, but as a general rule, the attorney can come from any state as long as they're up to speed on the laws in the state where the donor lives and where the egg retrieval will take place.
Thank you, thank you. And I know we're getting closer to the time. We need to wrap it up pretty soon, but I want to make sure that I'm addressing as many questions as possible from the attendees. So I have one more question for Dr. T, and then I have a question for both of you to close. Dr. T, how accurate is PGTA for gender selection?
Yeah, so PGTA tests for all 23 pairs of chromosomes. And if you look at the accuracy, if you would, for all chromosomes combined, we often quote in excess of 96%. If you were just to evaluate X and Y, the anticipated success or accuracy for that test is often considered to be in excess of 99%. So pretty accurate.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic for those that are trying to balance their families.
Yes, absolutely.
So thank you so much to both of you. To close, I have one more question to both of you, and it's about COVID, because as you know, the number of cases are increasing again. If there was a second wave, would you be canceling cycles? What do you anticipate you would be doing on the medical side as well as the legal side?
Do you want to go first, Andy?
Sure. So obviously we went through this back in February and March. What I can tell you is that they did shut down pretty much everything. The IVF facility shut down with a couple of exceptions that They sort of defied the shutdown orders. We were able, however, I was able to reach out to Mayor Garcetti and Governor Newsom and got letters declaring IVF clinics to be essential providers, so that if there is another shutdown, I do not believe there will be a mandated shutdown of IVF clinics like we saw earlier this year. The real question is the ability for intended parents to travel, surrogates and donors to travel to the IVF facility because of the enhanced risk of infection. And what we're seeing are, doctors like Dr. T that are finding creative ways to be able to do some of the screening and monitoring, perhaps with local providers, to reduce the amount of trips the donor or surrogate will have to make to the IVF clinic. And then agencies like yours, Perla, are doing a wonderful job of trying to match intended parents with surrogates and donors that are close to the IVF facility to, again, reduce the risk of exposure. So at least in California and in a number of these states, and California is one of the most restrictive states when it comes to coronavirus pandemic restrictions, they're going to allow the IVF clinics to remain open. The real issue is the level of risk the doctors, intended parents, surrogates, and donors are willing to accept.
What about you, Dr. Tourgeman? I know many clinics are allowing the surrogates and the egg donors to do the initial medical screening at a clinic that is local to them and only travel to do the embryo transfer and egg donation. Is there anything else that you think may change? Are you accommodating to that idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think our world has rapidly changed, and doing telescreening, if you would, is an appropriate and warranted situation in which you want to reduce everyone's risk. So if need be, we'll do a Skype or a Zoom or whatever type of interview that we need to screen the surrogate or egg donor. Oftentimes we'll do some initial blood tests to evaluate the surrogate or egg donor in their hometown. I've even gone so far as to something that's sort of, a physician that wants to evaluate the surrogate on their own to do an evaluation remotely at their hometown for their uterus, which again is, in an ideal situation, something that a physician would do themselves. But fortunately, there is a great deal of cooperation amongst clinics, and we're now allowed to have a great deal of information, including pictures that really do help us understand if everything is okay on the screening aspect. I think with regard to COVID and how this will impact us in the future, if this, if you want to call it a second wave or persistence and growth of the first wave, how that will affect us, I think that part of it will be determined by governmental agencies. As you know, we were asked to close in the past, and to be honest with you, I think that it made a lot of sense. A lot was unknown. The problem is a lot still is unknown, and we're ultimately follow the guidance of what the agencies tell us with regard to these procedures that can be deemed as elective by some.
Thank you. That is so helpful. I know here at Family Source, we have continued working all throughout. And when I speak to the intended parents, we talk about how lengthy this process can be and the kind of things that they can do in advance. And so it is good to know that there are accommodations that can be made so that they don't have to pause, their dream of creating their family. And on that note, I want to thank you, both of you. It is always an honor and a pleasure to speak to the two of you. I feel that we are family. We have known each other for so long and worked together for so long. And we're so appreciative of you sharing your knowledge and your expertise with all of those intended parents that are looking to create their family with the help of either an egg donor or a surrogate or both. So thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome, Perla. Thank you. It was an honor to be on this panel with you and David, and wish you and your family nothing but health and happiness through this holiday season.
Thank you. Likewise, Andy.
Thank you very much, Perla. Thank you for allowing us to participate. We're hopeful that your audience has been able to learn something from all of us. And anytime that we can help participate in some form like this, we're absolutely honored to do that.
Thank you so much, and have a good day.
You too, guys. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.